Well, good morning. Good morning to everyone. What a very good morning it is. I want to join in the many expressions of gratitude to our hosts, the Albanian Commissioner's Office. Tirana has been a revelation to me and to everyone that I've chatted with. What a delightful and beautiful city. What a complex history, but what a wonderful story of renewal and growth. And I think both the Prime Minister yesterday, the Mayor today, have given us really some inspiration for this conference, that we do progress as societies. And so congratulations and thank you to our hosts. And what a good morning of accountability we have had. The panel just recently was a wonderful exploration of the challenges of accountability that we see in the world today. But we also had a tremendous keynote by Christopher Doxey, and then an introductory remark by the mayor of Tirana. And I have to just reflect on the fact that he asked us not to forget the mayors, not to forget the people who trim the trees and clean the streets and tend to the parks and cities in which we live. And I think the message that the mayor was suggesting to us is that while our policy conversations at a global level are critically important, we must also at the same time think about the operational execution of those policies on the ground. To reflect on the book of Ken Bamberger and Deirdre Mulligan, that privacy exists, yes, on the books, in a policy level, but also privacy exists on the ground. And that's the topic of our panel this morning. We have a tremendous group of experts who have joined us to talk about the operational execution of privacy in the various environments in which it lives. How do we give life to data protection within organizations, both public and private? How do we build the infrastructure of data protection around the world? We have lots of work to do. Christopher Doxey gave us a tremendous overview of accountability from many different perspectives, and I have to reflect on a couple of things that he said. One, the components of accountability, according to Christopher, included an organizational commitment. Now, notably, he was not talking about just the private sector. He was talking about organizations in a large definition of that term, both public and private, that there has to be a commitment from executive levels, from the highest levels, all the way through an organization, that there has to be a structural program, that you need privacy program management. You need management structures, actual systems of processes and controls that help give life to data protection. And you need people. You need chief privacy officers and data protection officers, people who do the work, people who lead the work. And finally, you need transparency. He wrapped this up beautifully with a suggestion that accountability needs to be woven into the cultural business fabric of organizations. And what I find interesting about that is that it references the culture of the organization. And that suggests that it goes beyond the privacy statements and the compliance obligations into the ethos of how an organization handles data, how they think about protecting data and privacy in today's digital economy. Let's reflect on the growth that we have seen, because I think one of the things we will explore as a panel today is the idea of tension operationally as we try to respond to the challenges of the digital economy. I'm the CEO of the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We represent the people in the world who work in the field of data protection and privacy. Many of you, I hope, are members here in the audience today. In the past 3 years, the IAPP has seen quite tremendous growth. 2.5, 3 years ago, we had 25,000 members. And largely in part to Gdpr, we now have 52,000 members in 120 countries around the world. Let's just reflect on that is 52,000 people doing the work of data protection inside organizations in the public and private sector, 52,000 people who need to know how to actually give life to the various standards that we have. But that's not all. Earlier this year, the IAPP did some research looking at GDPR and the mandatory DPO requirement, and we surveyed all of the member states of the European Union and asked the data protection authorities for information on the number of DPOs that had been registered by organizations as required by the GDPR. 17 member states responded, and we have 375,000, I'm going to say that again, 375,000 registered DPOs in Europe today for organizations required to register a DPO. That's a lot of data protection officers. That's a lot of data protection officers in a very short amount of time. And when I talk to many regulators about this number, they actually think it's low. They actually think that we will need many more. And so we have a lot of work to do to ensure that those people are qualified and able to do their jobs, to ensure that the work of GDPR and other data protection standards around the world actually comes to life and is given the attention that it is due. We have a lot of work ahead of us. So this panel today, our expert panel, is going to explore how we do this work. This is not a policy discussion. This is a tactical discussion. What are the best practices? And I hope in some cases the not best practices, the failures that our panel have learned from, so that they can share that with you for you to also avoid those challenges. I think that this conversation is one that you should take a lot of notes from, because as you go back to your organization, whether you're a DPA or a private sector organization, what I hope we are going to be able to share is how are we getting the work done in data protection today. We have a wonderfully balanced panel of expert voices today. We have voices from around the globe, voices from industry, voices from regulators. We have voices that have much to share. We have voices that have gone from being a regulator to being in industry, and voices that have gone from being in industry to being a regulator. So many, many unique perspectives. What we're going to do today for our session is each one of our panelists is going to do a brief intervention. I've asked them to keep it to under 10 minutes, and I know that they will agree to that request. We also have the app up and running. So at any time, if you have a question now, get it into queue. I will be looking through the questions, and as appropriate, I will be adding those questions into our conversation. So we do hope that you'll engage through the app so that we can reflect upon the various issues that we're going to be discussing. All right, let me quickly introduce our panel and then ask them each to provide us with their intervention. So starting at my immediate right is Julie Brill. Julie Brill is a corporate vice president and deputy general counsel at Microsoft, where she oversees policy for data protection and privacy and trust writ large. Julie is notably formerly FTC commissioner and has a long and illustrious history as an expert in the field of privacy in the United States. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
To Julie's right is Alexandra Jasparlou. She is the director of the Knowledge Center from the Belgian DPA to give us a European and Belgian voice. So welcome, Alexandra. Next to Alexandra, we have Commissioner Stephen Wong from Hong Kong, a noted expert and prior host of this very conference 2 years ago. We had a wonderful conference 2 years ago in Hong Kong. Stephen, welcome to you. Next to Stephen, we have Simon Macdougall. Simon is the Executive Director of Technology, Policy and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. Simon previously worked in consulting in data protection, and so has come from the private sector to the regulator's office. Simon, welcome. And last but not least is Kalinda Reyna, the Chief Privacy Officer at LinkedIn. Kalinda has a long and storied career in data protection with stops at Nintendo and Apple, and now leads the privacy function for LinkedIn. So welcome, Kalinda. All right, panelists, are we ready?
Yes.
Let's begin. So Julie, you're first up. What say you about the operational imperatives of data protection?
So thank you so much, Trevor, and it really is a delight to be here. And I too want to just say thank you to our hosts, the Data Protection Commissioner of Albania, as well as the entire city of Tirana. I know my team has had a remarkably wonderful time, and I think the rest of us have experienced something that we just never expected, which is to be in Albania and to be in Tirana and to be together for a wonderful occasion. So congratulations to the Albanian delegation and team. I'm a Joni Mitchell fan. I love Joni Mitchell. And I sort of feel like my life has become a little bit like the song Both Sides Now. I don't know how many of you know it, but I have now seen life both as a regulator for, gosh, can I say 28 years? I mean, it was a really long time. And now I'm at one of the largest companies in the world, overseeing global privacy and regulatory affairs. So I really have kind of seen quite a bit. And what I actually think that regulators and companies share quite a lot when they're thinking about how to do privacy, how to ensure that privacy works inside their organizations. Right now, I think both companies and regulators are experiencing a very fast-changing environment, and also both regulators and companies are experiencing very intense and, in my opinion, appropriate scrutiny about what we're doing. So there's a lot that we share in terms of having to deal with an external environment that I don't think existed 3 years ago, certainly not 5 years ago, and certainly not back when I began in privacy 28 years ago. I also think that one of the things that both regulators and companies share that particularly relates to this topic is that we need to figure out how to operationalize privacy at scale. I don't think we have the ability anymore to think about privacy as a one-off issue or an issue that involves one important case or even 10 important cases. I think all of us, regulators, reading all the reports from the European Data Protection Board as well as individual commissioners' offices, your number of complaints and the issues that you're having to deal with is exploding. And similarly for companies, particularly those that operate in the type of ecosystem that Microsoft operates in, we have to figure out how to provide data subject rights, how to deal with complaints, and how to deal with issues at a scale that is unlike any that we have had to deal with before. So what does that mean in terms of actually operationalizing privacy at scale? My view is that that means that we need to build technical infrastructure in order to be able to operate. It's technical infrastructure not just for surfacing data subject rights, that is giving people access to their data through seeing it and correcting it and being able to delete it if they so choose, but also ensuring that there are operational controls that are sufficient so that as the laws go onto the books around the globe, whether it's California or Brazil or China, or changes to Gdpr, or anything in between, we need to be able to adjust our practices with appropriate buttons and dials and levers so that we can act with agility in terms of operationalizing what we do. And that's in particular, of course, for companies. Companies that operate around the globe in the way that Microsoft does, but of course we're not alone in this. We really need to have the kind of agility that allows us to deal with these issues, especially as they change over time. Well, so business model, let's just talk about that for a second. Microsoft is privileged in that we sort of sit at the center of the data ecosystem in many ways. What we do is we help all of our literally millions and millions of customers comply with the law. So we have to not only ensure that we are complying with respect to the data that we have, that is, that we have through our various consumer-facing products, but we have to provide tools for our enterprise customers from very, very large, the biggest Fortune 10, Fortune 100 companies to very small companies. We also have to provide tech for the little guy. And so what that means is we have to take the learnings that we have achieved in terms of how we're building our own solutions for ourselves, and we have to provide that to our customers. We call that first is third. What we do for ourselves in a first-party context, we have to be able to translate for our customers so that they can comply with a very complex set of, a very complex ecosystem. Okay, so what does that mean in particular? It means that we've got to build in privacy controls, we've got to give our customers dashboards, we've got to create tools for them so that they can deal with privacy issues with ease. It isn't going to be an issue of calling up someone who runs a phone center and saying, hey, can you handle this complaint? I mean, at some point you're going to have to do that, but a lot of this is going to have to become much more technical. So with respect to now switching to regulators for a moment, the biggest issue that regulators face, in my view, in addition to sort of operationalizing privacy and dealing with the complaints that you have at scale, is resources. You will never have enough resources. It's just the fact of life. You should ask for more and you should get more, but you will just unfortunately never have enough resources. So similar to how companies, I think, have to operationalize privacy at scale, I think regulators need to figure out how they're going to deal with complaints at scale. And I think what that means is, especially for regulators that are under a legal obligation to respond to every complaint, and many regulators are, you're going to need to, I think, develop systems that maybe use a little bit of artificial intelligence, maybe use a little bit of machine learning, where you can start to group your complaints together, you can start to identify those complaints that require or can be satisfied with a low-tech solution, or maybe I should say low-intensity solution, versus those complaints that need a high-intensity solution. So what is a low-intensity solution? Here's where regulators can borrow some learnings from consumer protection agencies. I think regulators, if you don't have one yet, you need to immediately, when you go home, create a mediation service. A mediation service so that when you have a complaint that ought to be a low-intensity complaint, gosh, someone sent my email to the wrong person, or someone disclosed by accident my credit card number or my social identity number, whatever, however you want to identify a low-intensity complaint, that should go to a mediation service, where there are people on your staff who are assigned to calling up the company and saying, hey, we got this complaint, you need to solve it, what are you going to do? And by the way, fill out this form to tell me that you've got a system in place. Otherwise, I'm going to kick this up to medium intensity or high intensity. I mean, you really have to start developing a system so that you can segregate out the types of complaints you have and you can start operating at scale. Okay, I want to let me just wrap up this little opening part, because there's so much we have to talk about. One other thing, as complexity grows and intensity grows for complaints for regulators, I think you're going to need to start partnering much more with other kinds of regulators, whether it's telecom, whether it's consumer protection, or competition. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about that. I think partnering is key. It's something that I always did throughout my career. Last thing I want to talk about is, how do you ensure that your people are fit to purpose for today's environment? Ensuring that you have people who can handle a complex environment, I think, is key also. So you need technical solutions and you need people that are fit for today. Who are the people that are fit for today? Trevor and I had a conversation about this yesterday. I think we're all going to be focusing on hybrid professionals. We're going to need people who are lawyers and technologists, lawyers and engineers, lawyers and philosophers, lawyers and ethicists. We're also going to need engineers who understand the law, engineers who understand ethics, engineers who are trained in privacy, etc. We're going to need, if I had one slot open on my team right now of my privacy operations team or my privacy legal team, and I had the choice between hiring someone who had 20 years experience dealing with privacy governance and privacy law and privacy policy versus someone who's right out of school, who's both an engineer and a lawyer, I would pick that second person hands down. Because that is the world we are facing. We need people who understand systems and also understand the law. So, with that, I'll pass the baton.
Fantastic. What a tremendous opening. Julie, thank you. And for all of you taking notes, I hope you captured some of these big ideas. First of all, the idea, and we can all share this, we should hold hands and cry together. We will never have enough resources. There will never be enough money, enough people, enough resources for us to do the work that we are facing. So we should all just recognize that and then start to look to the types of solutions that help us manage the enormous influx of work. Things like mediation services, I think that's tremendous. Things like finding the right people fit to purpose. Julie has raised the idea of the hybridized privacy pro. My team is in the audience. Maybe we can put a link up on the Twitter feed to a research paper that we did at the IEPP recently on the hybridized cyber professional, which really was a call to action for exactly this multi-talented professional. Julie, thank you. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll join July in thanking our Albanian host as well as ICDPPC organizers of this very fantastic event first. Well, I'm going to tell you about my experience, very short experience, you will understand, at the Belgian DPA. The Belgian DPA is extremely young. It was created by a law of December 2017, but it took 14 months to our Belgian political decision makers to appoint its 5 directors, which means that we only started our mission last April. So 1 year, more than 1 year, just about 1 year after the entry into force of the Gdpr. When we started, we inherited from the staff and budget of what we used to call the Belgian Privacy Commission, which was a purely advisory body in charge of issuing advice and recommendation and providing information to the public. The issue we are facing now, as you mentioned, is that we have much more missions and powers than this former commission. We are now entrusted with the missions to review the PIAs and code of conduct, to review and assess data breach notifications, to conduct investigations, and to enforce the GDPR through sanctions. We quickly realized that performing all these new tasks, in addition to those previously entrusted to the Commission, would be quite a challenge, and that we had to take measures to fix that. So far, we have taken 3 key measures to address this. Firstly, and this is no surprise, we have asked for a budget extension to a parliament in order to hire additional resources. To convince the parliament in a context where all Belgian public bodies had to decrease their expenditure by 2%, we have benchmarked our staff and budget with those of similar DPAs in Europe, have underlined the increasing amount of complaints, data breach notification, and so forth, and underlined as well the fact that since May 2018, we have much more tasks and powers than in the past. Secondly, we have performed an internal reorganization exercise aiming at increasing specialization and hence efficiency of our personnel. We are organized around 5 divisions. The first line service is in charge of answering basic questions by the public and of raising awareness through information campaigns. We also have an advisory division, which I am in charge of, and which is entrusted with the task of auditing draft bills' compliance with data protection laws and of issuing general recommendations on data protection issues. Our third division is taking care of the PIAs, code of conduct, and certification. We also have an investigation division as well as an administrative court in charge of issuing sanctions where needed. In the past, our lawyers and experts were doing a bit of everything. Drafting advice in the morning, revising DPAs in the afternoon, and preparing a court decision the day after. But since 3 weeks ago, each lawyer and expert is now dedicated to a given division of our organization. And we are convinced that this specialization will lead to efficiency gains. Thirdly, we are currently finalizing our strategic plan, and an important part of this is the definition of our strategic priorities. We are fully aware of the fact that we will not be able to answer all requests for information, handle all data breach, and find all non-compliant undertakings. So that's why we have defined 4 priority sectors, 3 GDPR provisions, and 4 practices, which we will scrutinize within the coming 5.5 years, which shows these priorities based on the amount of data and data subjects at hand, the sensitivity of the data at hand, and the invasiveness of the processing. This is our applications of the risk-based approach encouraged by the GDPR. The sector we chose to focus on are the telecom sector, the public sector, direct marketing sector, and the educational sector. As far as GDPR provisions are concerned, we will focus on access rights, legitimacy, and the role of the DPO. And to end up, as far as topics are concerned, we will focus on online privacy, pictures and cameras, and sensitive data. Well, that's where we stand today, after 6 months of activity. Needless to say that we know that we still have a lot to do to be able to survive. So now we have already agreed to work on the following additional tracks. We will invest more time and resource in cooperation with other DPAs from Europe, including for conducting joint investigations. We already visited very recently our friends from the CNIL and our colleagues from the Netherlands DPA. We also consider working together with other regulatory bodies, such as our National Competition Agency and our National Telecom Sector Regulator, and this in order to share expertise and resource. Contacts have already been taken, but the way it's going to work precisely, I'm just not able to tell you today. Besides this, we are working on an in-depth review and even revamp of our website, which we will feed with more tools and standard documents and tools in order to help DPOs and privacy experts and ultimately have an impact on the amount of increasing requests. Finally, even though our DPA is divided in 5 directions, which are independent, we are committed to sharing and exchanging information while exercising our own competence. The sharing of knowledge should allow the 5 of us not to reinvent the wheel. To give you an example, a study conducted in the framework of an investigation will be shared with the director in charge of issuing general recommendation, who will, based on this, produce a recommendation, which will, in turn, be reused by our first-line service to answer specific questions in relation to the topic of the recommendation. Well, you had, Trevor, a specific question with regard to, and it was addressed by Julie in a nice way, how do we stay connected with new technologies? How do we think that we will be able to follow this technological evolution? Well, to be very practical, we've recently hired 4 ICT engineers. They just started a few months ago, and 3 out of our 5 cells are equipped with ICT engineers within their staff. We also, at my knowledge center, so the advisory body, we prepare the content of our advice and recommendation, but any decision has to be voted by an external panel of representatives of the civil society, which includes specialists in the fields of mathematics, statistics, and economics. And of course, algorithms and the like are no secret for those guys. For some of our mission, we may also informally consult an external advisory body, which does not exist, but will be composed of representatives of all sectors and likely include specialists in new technologies. And finally, we May, conduct what we call public consultations before starting drafting recommendations. And we did that last month, a few months ago, and the idea of this first public consultation was to precisely understand which technologies are used by the direct marketing ecosystem players. Well, to wrap up, as you may have understand, we are a very young and recently appointed DPA, currently working with existing and insufficient staff, and launching a bunch of initiatives to try to manage the increasing amount of work and to be able to follow the evolution of technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think we see some themes emerging, and I think these are powerful, that in the face of an enormous amount of work, one of the clear responses is a ferocious discipline around prioritization of that work. And it's very interesting to hear how the Belgian DPA has gone through that process and chosen particular issues and industries upon which to focus. Also, that strategic planning is important. Merely responding to the work of the moment will only leave you in the moment. If you want to get ahead of the work, you want to plan and prepare, you need to do strategic planning looking ahead into the future. And then two final things. One, sharing information is tremendously vital to this process. This conference is a tremendous example of that. But gathering with other people who are facing similar work is tremendously useful to professionals in this space. And then finally, another call for the hybridization of the field, that privacy professionals are not just lawyers, we are not just policy professionals, rather we come from a number of backgrounds and skills, and those skills brought to us by IT professionals, by risk managers, process managers, and others are tremendously helpful to actually managing this work. Alexandra, thank you. We now turn to Commissioner Stephen Wong from Hong Kong. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trevor. The commission or the authority in Hong Kong is not a young one. I have to say that we're a bit in the middle age now. We have more than 23 years of practicing experience. Today, I'm asked to talk about challenges from the DPA's point of view, I hope. And you mentioned at the outset that there are more than 500,000 DPOs. And you haven't mentioned that there are also a huge amount of lawyers instructed by this 500,000 DPOs. Julia mentioned about the professionals, the IT people, the engineers. Okay, so the challenge that we in Hong Kong, out of the recent data breach incidents, is that we have to tackle a large amount of professionals, the DPOs, the lawyers, the engineers. So resources, human resources in particular. We are never short of, resources are never enough for an operation like ours. So I share the same view that we need to put in more resources, human resources, financial resources, and in particular nowadays, the technical, the professional, the IT people. And we try to ask our lawyers to study IT. No, they say, look, no, we are too old. We ask our IT people to learn more about law. No, perhaps this is something different, a different discipline. So from last year onwards, in difficult cases that we have to deal with, I have commissioned experts to help. Experts in the IT field, experts in the legal field as well. Because we cannot, we simply, as a DPA, we simply cannot say that we can do it. Because we are talking about the rights, the fundamental human right of individuals. In an office like ours, no matter how experienced we claim to have or to be, we still have to put the priority, put the interests of the individuals first, because especially in the interests of the people of Hong Kong, because they are very quite well aware of the protection, the right being protected, privacy right protection. They have a culture of lodging inquiries and complaints. And they expect, and this is expectation, they expect that we'll deal with it independently, fairly, and efficiently. Every year, we handle more than 10,000 inquiries, more than 2,000 complaints that we have to investigate, and more than 300 data breaches, despite the fact that data breaches notification in Hong Kong is still voluntary. It's not mandatory yet. So we have a huge problem of resources, but we have to deal with it. Now, over the last 4 months or so, we received 2,600 complaints in respect of the social unrest using internet, online and offline, using data on the internet as a weapon against those holding different or opposing views in relation to, an amendment bill. Let me tell you more about this. I think most of you might have heard of the occupation of the airport. I can assure you those were the only 2 days that the airports was not working. Now, it's okay now, okay? So don't be misled by any false news that our airport is not working. But we suffer a great deal from it. This amendment bill originated from a murder case. The murder took place in Taiwan, not in Hong Kong, but the murderer returned to Hong Kong. Okay, so everybody would have thought that this suspect or criminal should be returned to Taiwan for trial. Unfortunately, there is no existing arrangement between Taiwan and Hong Kong for the return of criminals. Okay? The members of the public think that it is not fair, not just, not in the interest of justice, not in the interest of the murdered. So the government put forward an amendment bill trying to bridge the gap, plug the loophole by returning the suspect back to Taiwan. But the spilled over effect is that in drafting the legislation, mainland China is put together in the amendment bill so that there is an impression that if you commit an offense in Hong Kong, you will be sent back to the mainland of China for trial. And then because of certain issue in relation to explainability, the government should have been able to explain the issues clearer and in a better way. But people in Hong Kong tend to feel that this is a matter of confidence and trust because the mainland of China has a very different legal system and capital punishment is still a current way of punishment in the mainland of China. So they expressed doubt. Thousands of people took to the streets to express their discontent, their doubts. But after a few months, the people start to use personal data of the opposing members in the society, in the community, to attack those people having a different view. They compile personal data profiles, starting with government officials, police officers, and then followed by the other camp doing the same thing, exactly the same thing, against the protesters. So we have, over the last 4 months, I have received more than 2,600 complaint cases, and involving more than 1,200 links on the internet. Now, this is the background of using or misusing personal data as a weapon through the powerful network online and the devices and the applications. The difficulty, the challenge that we faced was most of these operators of the platforms, social platforms, discussion forums, were outside Hong Kong, operating outside Hong Kong. So we don't have, our legal arms are not long enough to even touch them. Despite this, we wrote to these operators outside Hong Kong, requesting them to stop that, to provide details of the suspects or the offenders. Many of them will reply to say that, sorry, we can't help. Some of them did take our advice and did something constructively and positively, but not all of them. So I would like to stress, this is a current challenge for the authorities like us in Hong Kong, where it is absolutely an offense under the law, on our law. It is absolutely illegal to do such things, including spreading hate speeches and so on, violent messages, intimidating messages and so on. But we cannot do much about it. And that's why I would appeal to not only to the international DPAs or our fellow DPAs, but also the tech giants. Have a look at your social responsibility. Have a look of your ethical standard and also privacy policies, whether it is right, whether it is the mind of the right-thinking people, the customers, that you should continue to allow these things happening, or to by not taking down the offensive messages from your website or from your apps. So this is something that we would like to address not as a current challenge, and also in future. I think we might have more cases of this nature. I hope Barcelona is not following suit, despite the fact that they look like what we have in Hong Kong currently. But this is something that we should, as the conference resolved yesterday or 2 days ago, in a resolution, we should promote and foster, strengthen the cross-border global collaboration in law enforcement, in the investigation of cases of this kind. So this is a very unique, I would say, the challenge that we have been facing in Hong Kong over the last few months. So this is a bit of experience that we would like to share with all of you. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you. I take away many things from that. Thank you. One very powerful message at the beginning is seemingly simple, but I think incredibly effective for organizations, and that is know that you cannot do it all yourself. Get help. Find experts. You do not necessarily need to add full-time staff every time. Some of that expertise is tremendously challenging to find, and it may be more straightforward to go look for it outside. And then thank you for such a clear and full explanation of the challenges faced by your organization in the face of the unrest in Hong Kong currently. The doxing issues we've been reading with fascination, and as you mentioned, going in many directions there. I can only imagine the challenges associated with that. So Commissioner, thank you for your intervention. Next, let me turn to Simon Macdougall. Simon is with the Information Commissioner's Office. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Trevor. And I'm going to divert a bit from the notes I had, Trevor, which I see the panic on Trevor's face. I say that partly because some of the points I was going to make have already been made in a far more articulate fashion by other panelists, but also just to build a little bit, Stephen, on your point. I think one of the challenges we have in looking at the future now is that we live in such a data-saturated world where there is a proliferation of data and a personalization of data that it's so hard for us to keep up with the new services and the new threats. And so, Stephen, your point around data as a weapon and doxing, which has been something which has been around for a long time but been weaponized in a very particular situation, again, is a great example of just a new threat, a new angle. This is my personal opinion, it's a bit controversial. I do think in some ways, at least within Europe, the privacy community kind of got a bit behind itself because of GDPR. GDPR, a huge number of positive changes, but it meant we got very compliance-focused for a while. And as we were doing that, the range of services and the way data was being used was changing so rapidly that if we didn't have GDPR, maybe we would have focused a little more on some of the technological changes. And now we're having to catch up a little bit. And we're having to say, okay, well, what is this new world about? And catching up on how this technology is being used is an ongoing challenge for authorities. I think one great example of how we're now having to think in a much more expansive way is this question of prioritization and resource prioritization. I mean, I echo all the other points made around we're all working on limited resources, and we could all double our resources and still be working on limited resources. But if you think about the kind of things we're being asked to prioritize, so many of you know one of my pet projects is around ad tech and advertising technology. It's something we're doing a lot of work on, which is a sector, an activity where every day there are billions of ad impressions using a lot of information about people. On the whole, the majority of those ad impressions are just being used to serve slightly more personalized adverts. But there's a huge amount of volume, and there's a lot of data, and then there's a question of how much harm is occurring per transaction, but there's billions of transactions, and with some of the firms we're talking to, trillions of data points. But then we're in the UK, we're also looking as an ongoing case around UK police authorities insisting on having access to the full contents of a rape victim's mobile phone before they'll progress the case. And we're being asked, how do you compare those two? How do you allocate resources between those two activities just as two activities we're dealing with? And that's the challenge that comes from living in this data-saturated world. In the old days, go back to the 1984 Act in the UK, we were worried about large, structured, relational databases being held by government authorities. Those things are still an issue. But there are so many things now, and we're having to kind of think broadly, because in the end, data is everywhere, and so we're being asked to regulate such a range of situations. So I think that's a huge challenge for all of us, and is pushing us into new areas, new ethical areas. I do think it means that as regulators we have to continue challenging ourselves to be more data-driven in what we do, to challenge the qualitative decisions we're making around prioritization and try and work out how we can do it better. We all probably have a kind of little equation, a little algorithm in the back of our minds that go, okay, it's privacy risk is something to do with the actual harm to the individual times the number of times this happens, the volume of data. There's some kind of way of articulating that. But very few of us probably actually have that down into something which is mathematical, is consistent, is rigorous. And we have to do that. And especially because our perimeter is expansive. So in the UK, if I compare ourselves to our financial services regulator, our financial services regulator regulates 59,000 firms and has 3,500 people. We have a bit over 700 people, which is a lot for a privacy regulator, but we have millions of data controllers. We have 500,000 contact points with individuals a year, 40,000 complaints. We can only begin to start to manage that if, Judy, to your point, if we start to bring in automated ways of managing that scale, because we're trying to regulate a perimeter which is much larger than in a particular sector. We're a horizontal regulator in a vertical regulatory world. So how do we move forward and be more data-driven? What data points do we need? And I'm not going to say for a second that the ICO has a solution to this. I think we are working and thinking very hard about it, but we haven't got a magic algorithm, otherwise I'd have an amazing slide and we could share it. I do think part of the work we have to do is develop our own data science capabilities, be comfortable with these big data questions, these AI questions, share resources between regulators on this, and work with our friends in the technology sector and elsewhere to work out how we better do that. But we need to get to a stage where we're saying, okay, the reason why we're pursuing this sector or this case is because we've got a more quantitative notion of harm. That's a direction of travel rather than something we're going to solve in the next 6 months. I want to make one more point around this expansive point, which is I think nowadays privacy has a perimeter. I think in the old days, we looked at our sector and we had our issues and we dealt with them, but we often didn't have to interact too hard with other regulators. And now, because of this data-soaked world we live in, we are often having to interact with other regulators far more than before. So one of the relationships I manage in the UK is our relationship with our Competition and Markets Authority. And in the old days, I think we, as regulators, were ships that passed in the night. We were on nodding terms, but we didn't do much work with our Competition Authority. And I think we've realized in the last couple of years that we are intensely interested in the relationship between the individual and the large organization that's processing the data. And the Competition Authority is intensely interested in how that data set is being used to exercise sometimes data dominance in a market. But what we see as a one individual to a large corporation relationship, and they're seeing as how a data set is being used to exercise insight and sometimes dominance, it's the same data set. And we're just seeing it from different perspectives. Right. And so we're working out how to dance that dance, how to have a discussion with a regulator which is mainly formed of economists rather than lawyers, and sees market interventions a very different way. But we're talking about the same organizations and the same dynamics. So how do we get that dialogue going? So I think overall we're in the foothills of a much larger and more complicated world. And as data protection authorities, we have to embrace that. And we have to find different ways to work with fellow regulators internationally, regulators in our own countries, centers of excellence and insight from academia, from technology elsewhere. Because we're not going. These are very big questions. We're not going to develop in-house solutions. So we have to be much more expansive and have those relationships to move forward.
Simon, thank you. Another tremendous intervention. Simon started with a recognition that in many cases we are behind, that we are chasing some of these issues from a position where technology is innovated in the marketplace, data practices have innovated in the marketplace. Simon used the example of doxing, and we have to learn what that is. We have to understand how it happens. We need to understand that sometimes that happens outside of the jurisdictional control. Commissioner Wong mentioned the short arms. He needed longer arms in order to actually address some of the doxing challenges they were facing. And despite my easy cliche of saying that ferociously disciplined prioritization is important, Simon reminded us that that's hard, that that's really, really hard, that sometimes data protection authorities are obliged to respond to every complaint that they receive, and many of you are, under law, obliged to respond to every single complaint that you receive. And then sometimes we are presented with impossible choices in regulatory environments where there simply is not a choice to be made. You must do both or many things. Simon gave us the example of ad tech versus rape kits. Where do you allocate the resources in the DPA to understand that strategically? Finally, I want to highlight one of the things that Simon's mentioned because I think it's worth bringing forward even more, and that is that many of the data protection authorities in this audience operate as horizontal regulators across the economies and societies in which they exist. You touch data as a phenomenon across your society. And you increasingly are going to need to interact with and engage with the vertical regulators that are responsible for various aspects in your society. Simon mentioned competition regulators, antitrust clearly, but financial services and healthcare. You're going to find that you have to get up, get into a car, drive to another government building, and talk to your colleagues in other regulatory and governmental agencies in order for you to effectively do your job. Simon, thank you. That was fantastic. And last but not least, certainly not least, Kalinda Reyna. Kalinda from LinkedIn, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Trevor. And I have the benefit of gotten to listen to all of the previous panelists, and I think one of the key themes that we hear as each of us are discussing is the idea of a lack of resources. And I think one of the things that we can do to solve for that is to leverage what we already have. And now that might sound a bit unfair to ask of all of us, but I think as Trevor mentioned at the beginning, I've worked at several companies, and in my first role, I was a team of 1. And then I got to my second role, and I was a team of 3. And now, finally, we are a team of 11. So the idea of tech giants, as one of the few companies here that sits in the Silicon Valley, I will say we also are resource constrained. And so what I'd like to suggest are 3 different ways in which the 3 communities represented here today can address that. One is for companies, and I'd like to talk a little about a culture of privacy. The second thing is for us as a community, and there I press creativity. And then for regulators, I think I ask for creating greater awareness. So in the perspective of companies, what do we mean when we talk about a culture of privacy? And I think I speak to this from a unique perspective of a company that was originally thought of by 2 founders in the late 90s who thought that doing a dating business might be really successful. And they quickly failed at it, but learned a good lesson, which was that trust was essential to relationships. And from that, they built LinkedIn, which is an organization built on relationships and the trust that exists in it. And so we are fortunate at our company to have a very value-driven culture. So by that, it was pretty easy when I first got to the company, and I had, as Andrea had asked her previous panel, what was your aha moment? My aha moment of how was I going to get GDPR done when I had a team of only, at the time, 3 people, was to recognize that our values was something I was going to have to leverage across the entire company because it was something every employee clearly understood. They may not understand privacy, but they understood our concept of members first, which meant that we make our decisions from the perspective of what is best for our members before we think of anything else. And so I'd say that for any companies that are trying to figure out how to leverage their resources, one of the first things to do is to really ground yourself in the values of your organization. And now we were very lucky in that I come from an organization that was very values driven, but for those that aren't, I think that's a particular challenge to refocus. The second thing that I was able to do to leverage was to get leadership involved. And Caroline from MasterCard had mentioned this as well. I think most of us in companies know that if you're not able to get leadership on board, it's a real challenge to get the rest of the company. And so we tackled that by really getting our CEO to understand privacy, not from the perspective, quite honestly, of GDPR fines, but of how it was going to impact our members and why it mattered to them. And then we took that message. We have a very young culture at LinkedIn, so we have to make things exciting. So we did an actual documentary with our executives talking about their first experiences with the internet and why privacy had mattered to those first experiences, to get our very young employees engaged in understanding why it mattered. And then the last piece that I think is very important for companies is education, and that's true for all of us, whether we're regulators or companies, is how do we educate people? And one of the things that all companies do is train, but training can be a bit boring on an annual basis. So how do you get people to think about it on an everyday level? And so one of the things that we have done is create trust as an operating principle at our company, and what that means is every 2 weeks in the Silicon Valley, we have, a lot of companies have this thing where we get the entire organization, all the employees together and talk about what's happening at the company. That's called our all hands. And so our CEO talks about trust at every all hands every 2 weeks. So that keeps it very constant for people. The other thing we've tried to do is make it relevant to our employees. And I think this is a challenge for the average person in a company. How do you get them to care about privacy? And you educate them on how it's impacting their own lives. And so that's something where we don't just talk about privacy at our company, but privacy in general of how it's impacting our employees, many of whom live in the Silicon Valley. And then the last thing is, how do you scale all of this? Because as Commissioner Wong said, one of the hardest things is figuring out when you don't have enough resources, how do you do this? And so what we've done is we've created a Privacy Champions program that takes our employees through a 6-month-long course. They actually have to complete the IAPP certification, and they have to be nominated by a manager. And then what the expectation is, we take people from all over our organization, specifically people in marketing, in product, in sales, in customer service, and bring them together for this course that my team teaches, and then make them take the IAPP certification. And then the last part of the process is the part that I think has been most fruitful, which is asking these individuals to go back to their teams, not only to speak up in meetings to help make people more aware in their organizations, but part of becoming a privacy champion at the company is completing a project with my team where they're required to go back to their own organization and find a problem that they want to solve. And so all of that combined allows us to actually, even though we are a small but mighty team of 10, reach out across and make allies in parts of our organization that the legal team doesn't often think to reach out to. So engineers, sales, product, marketing. So that's what we're doing at companies that are really trying to build out this culture of privacy. I think the second thing I'd like to suggest to this community of what can we do to leverage more and get more out of what we have available already is to bring and invite more folks into the community. So privacy engineers are an incredible group of people who are trying to really start a profession that I think we need more of. As Julie mentioned, this is something that exists at Microsoft, and that technology can really help. And having people with some of that greater creativity that some of us as lawyers may not always have can really help us to come up with solutions that may actually allow us to scale. And then lastly, I would say to the regulators that we need to find a way to really leverage the public. I think Commissioner Labaro had spoken at the Hong Kong conference 2 years ago about what he was doing in the Philippines to create greater awareness amongst individuals in the Philippines, regular citizens understanding why privacy matters, so that actually some of those individuals, if the greater public understands privacy better, they can actually speak with their feet. And Simon had said in his panel yesterday that one of the most forceful things at Uber is not the fines, but was the threat of a hashtag delete Uber campaign. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you think about companies, is that we need to get the public more educated about privacy and about what some of those threats could potentially be, so that they actually can speak and take some stance as well. Thank you.
Kalinda, thank you very much. Just to capture, Kalinda gave us a passionate defense of culture, the incredible importance of culture, beyond your privacy statements, beyond the policies and programs and practices in your organization. If the culture does not align to the goals that you are seeking, you're lost. You're lost. And that very much follows the keynote address this morning from Christopher Hoxie. The other thing I find interesting in your remarks, Kalinda, is the idea that we will never have enough professionals to manage this issue in a complete way, and so you must find force multipliers. Stephen Wong gave us the idea of go outside and get expertise. Kalinda's given us the idea of Deputize champions within your organization. Create mechanisms where you have a hub and spoke system so that you have around the organization agents of good data practices that you have trained, that you have baked in your culture so that they can help, even if their full-time job is not data protection, they can help your organization move forward on these issues. And then finally, a call for public education, for citizen, consumer education, so that we triage, we address many of these concerns before they even arrive at a data protection authority or an organization in the private sector, that citizens, consumers, human beings are making decisions on their own accord with regards to data based on what they understand to be happening in the marketplace. Wow. We have had a tremendous series of interventions. We also have a great list of questions. We're going to go into rapid fire mode here because I think that we otherwise won't be able to get to many of the issues that our audience are raising and some of the additional questions that I have. So I'm going to go one by one and raise some of these issues. Kalinda, you mentioned privacy engineering. One of the questions was, is this conference not missing the engineering community? Are we not bringing in some of the standards bodies, or are we not missing them? I will note that ISO was here this week with a side event, which was very much encouraging. But just give us a minute on the importance of the relationship between this community, the policy community, the regulatory community, and the global technology standards bodies and engineering communities that are also talking about these issues.
Well, I think we sometimes forget that there are more than just, the lawyers and the regulators in the room thinking about these issues. And I see that sitting in the Silicon Valley with our engineering teams and previously when I was at Apple as well, seeing the way in which the lawyers and the engineers and the product managers as well are interacting to think through, how do you design these products? I mean, when we talk about privacy by design, it's literally sitting in a room and whiteboarding, well, here's the problem I see from a legal sense, here's the engineering solution, how do we build that into the product? Those three people working together. And I think trying to educate the engineers as well as the product folks on some of the legal aspects and creating greater crossover between the organizations, like you say, ISO being here and others, standards bodies in the engineering space, beginning to work together with the standards bodies here who are thinking about it from a legal standpoint, is going to help us as technology continues to innovate, as Simon was pointing out. It's hard to keep up with. There really is no way for the law to keep up with it as it changes so dramatically.
Excellent. So for the program committee for Mexico City, the intersection of privacy engineering and privacy policy and regulatory functions could be a very valuable and fruitful discussion. All right, then let's talk about educating citizens, consumers, data subjects, people who are actually having their data used. Alexandra and Stephen, maybe you, and Simon, maybe you can talk about it from a regulatory perspective. How does that help us to manage the influx of work, but also just the general response and improvement of data protection in society writ large? Alexandra, maybe you can start. How does citizen education work at the Belgian Data Protection Authority?
Well, first, citizens education is part of our legal mission. So we have somehow to educate citizens. Well, the law hopefully doesn't tell us what we have to do in practice, so we have kind of a free choice. And we can use, for instance, either, as I mentioned earlier, a website to post webcasts or small dedicated topical sheets on specific topics. That's one of the options that we've chosen at the Belgian Privacy Commission. And I think it works, because we see that many people are indeed having a look at those, well, little dedicated contributions. But I think it's not enough, because we see the flow of questions were still coming directly to us via our telephone hotspot or via letters, emails, or others. So we have to be more proactive. And one of the things we've done, and it has it's quite successful. We have launched 2 awareness-raising campaigns to the attention of the wide public, and one, which was a great success, was targeting the children's. It's called I Decide, so ik beslis, je décide. And the idea is to educate our youngest citizens to the rights they have, to the rights their teachers may have, or to the questions that, can my mom have a look at my short messages? And we know that this campaign has, well, had, as I said, quite a lot of success. We are still, well, declining it with other forms so that it really reach a very wide public of young citizens in Belgium. And now we are launching a second one, which is more dedicated to SME, because we realize that many questions which are entering our services come from small and medium enterprise, which are absolutely not aware of what their obligations and rights are under GDPR. So I think these awareness-raising campaigns are really fruitful and should be duplicated.
So awareness-raising campaigns. Do not forget the power of your website. Stephen, in Hong Kong, what have you done to educate the Hong Kong population around their rights and also the ways that they can self-empower? What tools have you given them?
Yep. Public education is always on the top of our priority lists. We have been educating members of the public, not only the individuals, but also enterprises, organizations as well. So we have done all sorts of conventional education, tactics, courses, and everything, even through the channel of IAPP and so on. But the interesting thing is that sometimes people still think that we have not been doing enough. You know why? Nowadays, younger generation don't watch television. They don't read papers. They read their devices, their gadgets. So we have to change our ways or our channels to disseminate the education materials. So we have to redo all the publicity materials so that it can be put online. And of course, we have to pay for the time. That's how the tech giants make money, isn't it? So we have to pay for that. And then it's a matter of resources now. Okay, and it's not cheap, and so we have to reinvent sometimes all the materials, so that the younger generation, including children, as you mentioned about children, that they will be able to reach the messages that we aim to deliver to them. So this is something that we are revisiting our education policy now.
So, Stephen, thank you. Another call for public awareness and education. I love the idea of Commissioner Wong as a social media celebrity. That's actually fantastic, using social media and other tools, all of the modalities available to communicate to your populations. Simon, I'm going to ask you a very pointed question because you changed your script at the last minute. I'm going to change my question at the last minute. You mentioned that you're covering ad tech right now. And as a veteran of the ad tech industry, I know how just tremendously complicated and complex that environment is. How do we ever get to a point where a data subject, a human being in society today, can understand how their data is being used so that they feel empowered about their data? How do we answer that question?
Well, I think this actually ties in very nicely to the discussion around public awareness and education as well. I think in both these cases, we have to recognize that engagement and awareness is a critical foundation of everything we do. But at the same time, it can only be one component because the world we live in is too complex sometimes to explain to people in the street. And even if you explain it so they get it, there's still, in many cases, a huge imbalance of power between the individual and the organization. When my 11-year-old son at home sits there and watches videos on YouTube, I'm not picking on YouTube or Alphabet or Google here, but just as an example, there is an algorithm working out what to recommend to him next. And 70% of YouTube videos are taken from their recommended channel. It's an incredibly effective way of keeping people engaged.
Yeah.
That's my son against billions of dollars of worth of investment in how to drive engagement through that particular channel.
Yeah.
No amount of awareness or education is going to make that a straight fight. So as we're talking about these very complex worlds we live in, we have to enable people to understand it as best they can and engage, and with ad tech as well. But we're not going to get people to really engage on the full, incredibly impressive, scary but impressive world of real-time bidding and how this auction happens in the blink of an eye. We've actually got to say, no, we're engaged on accountability, responsibility. It's up to these organizations that are processing the data to do it in the right way. Otherwise, awareness just becomes a panacea. And we have to say, no, that in this complex world we live in, the main responsibility goes back to the data controller or whatever terminology you're going to use, whoever decides what's happening with the processing. Responsibilities on them.
Interesting. So good data stewardship from the organization responsible for the data. Excellent. Julie, I'm going to turn to you with a bit of a different question, and that is, we have been talking largely about responding to the world and the regulatory structure, the policy structure as it exists, as we understand it. But one of the things that we know in today's digital revolution is that innovations are challenging us every day, and that there are many questions that we simply don't know the answer to, that there are questions posed by the digital economy that GDPR and other regulatory structures do not necessarily address. One of the common ways for us to think about those challenges is that of ethical frameworks, of data ethics. Talk to us about the role of data ethics at Microsoft and how that is a tool for addressing the great unknown of the digital economy, which is great and massive.
Yes, we do have a massive area where, I think a number of the speakers, Simon and others, have addressed the notion that, with the massive amount of data we have, with the way in which data is being used, we have laws, but we don't actually have enough laws. We also heard Brad Smith talk about that yesterday, that we've had 2 waves of privacy, which have been good and appropriate. We need a 3rd wave. But what do we do before those laws are on the books? Or what do we do in the area where it would be really hard to draft a law because of all the balancing interests that might be at stake? So for instance, one area which comes to mind immediately when you think about data ethics is the notions and the concepts around facial recognition technology. Very, very powerful technology, very important technology. Lots of scientific great uses. Linking lost children with their parents, solving diseases. There are lots of things, very, very good things that can come from facial recognition. There are also incredible potential abuses that can come from facial recognition. At Microsoft, we've actually been calling for a law on facial recognition, at least in the United States. I know our friends in Europe say, hey, we've got that law. It's GDPR. Query whether GDPR is really fit for purpose in terms of dealing with all of the subtleties and nuances around facial recognition, not just when it's used by companies, but when it's used by law enforcement. So I'll just put that out as a question, which you can all come to a side event that Microsoft and the Future of Privacy Forum are sponsoring, where we will talk more about facial recognition. But what we do at Microsoft in the absence of an area where we do think that there should be a law, what we do is we have ethics boards that we have created, internal ethics boards. They're not dissimilar from institutional review boards. There's been a lot of discussion around bringing in that concept from the healthcare system into data and into privacy, and we have essentially done that. We have an AI review board It's called Ether. That doesn't matter what the acronym stands for. But what we do is we have a group that is composed of engineers, it's composed of lawyers, and it's composed of senior people at the company who are thinking about the overall business proposition, as well as the overall reputation around trust that Microsoft needs to maintain. And we look at individual projects. We look at individual proposals for use of our APIs with respect to facial recognition or with respect to other technologies. We look at particular issues around customer uses. I mean, there might be some customers for which this technology, given their plans, would be completely appropriate. And there might be some customers where we are really worried that there will be human rights violations and other problems. And so we've turned down customers. We've said, you know, sorry, we're not going to give you that technology because we believe that it will be used to harm your citizenry, to engage in human rights or potential human rights problems. But what we need, what every company needs, I think, that is going to be dealing with these very, very powerful technologies or this ubiquitous use of data that can be abused with respect to vulnerable populations and with respect to children, minorities, et cetera, is we really do need to be thinking about the ethics. And I'll just say one other thing very quickly. I know we're almost out of time. But this needs to happen not just inside companies and not just with respect to the general population, but we need to start training people in law schools, in engineering schools, and in business schools about ethics. Because they're our future, and they're the ones who are going to be focusing on how to deal with all these problems going forward. So we really need ethical training.
That's fantastic. Julie, thank you. I think it absolutely is clear that understanding the ethical constructs of the use of data inside organizations and how technologies disrupt and change the context of data use is incredibly important, and pulling together multidisciplinary groups, whether it's in the form of a review board or not, but pulling together multidisciplinary perspectives, absolutely important. All right, this absolutely is the one-word answer round. The IAPP has surveyed our members now for many years. We do a governance survey with EY, and it is a tremendously valuable report. And this year and last year, we asked over 1,000 respondents, what are the top 3 challenges coming out of GDPR from an operational perspective? And we can probably broaden this to many privacy and data protection laws around the world. So you get to answer with one thing, what do you think was in the top 3? And then I'll share with you what actually was in the top 3 from an operational challenge perspective. So the top 3 operational challenges, Kalinda, we're going to start with you. What do you think one of the top 3 operational challenges as a result of GDPR was?
DPIAs.
DPIAs. Okay, there's one. Simon? It's not that hard, Simon. Come on.
Breach reporting.
What's that?
Breach reporting.
Breach reporting. Okay, 72-hour breach reporting. Commissioner Wong?
Investigation.
Investigations. All right, Alexandra?
Well, from a DPA perspective, you mean?
Both, but largely operational inside organizations. So the implementation of GDPR inside organizations.
Well, getting the buy-in of the top management.
Upper management support. Yeah. Okay, that was number 1 on Christopher Doxey's list for accountability. Julie, what do you think?
Data hygiene.
Data hygiene. All right, well, Kalinda, winner, here we go. Number 3 was DPIAs. Number 2 was data portability. Number 1 was the right to be forgotten. Those were the top 3 most difficult issues to implement, according to the respondents in our survey. To our panelists, I want to thank you for your contributions today. We know that we have an enormous amount of work ahead of us. Every single day feels like we are underwater with the amount of work in the field of data protection. But if there is one thing that gives me hope, one thing that tells me I will break the surface and breathe, it's that we have tremendous leaders like these on our stage right now who are doing the very hard work of data protection around the world. And I hope you'll join me in thanking them. Thank you.